Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take the world's most complicated events and ideas and, well, we give you the distilled insight you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we are opening our dive with a really fascinating, almost unbelievable scenario. Imagine a novel published back in 1988. It's celebrated by critics, showered with awards, and then almost overnight, it triggers global riots, international political crises, and a death sentence from a government.
And that's the story of Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses.
Exactly.
But our deep dive today is about so much more than just a literary scandal. We're going to be looking at the source material to explore a much deeper theme. It's really a study in how different cultures respond when their most sacred figures are challenged.
Right.
And most critically, we're going to contrast the violence that erupted with a very articulate, principled, and completely nonviolent Islamic response. It's an approach that's rooted in historical mercy and intellectual rigor, and it stands as a really profound counterpoint to what dominate the headlines.
Okay, so let's set the stage. We've got two, you could say, very distinct stacks of source material here. First, we have the details of the book itself, its literary ambition, why it was praised, and then the disastrous global impact it had.
And the second stack.
The second is this contrasting theological blueprint. It's for how Muslims should respond to exactly this kind of provocation. It's an approach that's all about wisdom, compassion, and upholding the dignity of faith through conduct, not through violence.
So a study in contrasts, the celebrated art versus the lethal consequence, and then a peaceful intellectual antidote.
That's the mission. Let's start at the source of it all, the book itself. Before it became this political symbol, what did Rushdie actually write, and why did the literary world embrace it so enthusiastically?
Well, you have to understand its ambition first. At its core, the Satanic Verses is a work of magic realism. I mean, it's sprawling. The main story follows two Indian Muslim expatriates, Jibril Farishta and Saladin Chamcha.
And these aren't just any guys, right? They're famous.
Exactly. Jibril is a huge Bombay film superstar, and Saladin is a very sophisticated, very assimilated voice actor living in London. The whole thing kicks off in this spectacular way where they both miraculously survive a mid-air explosion of a hijacked jet.
And that fall, that survival, that's the key, isn't it? It's like a literal rupture of reality.
Precisely. It's a rebirth into chaos. They survive this impossible fall, but they are transformed. And that transformation is really the engine of the novel. Jibril wakes up with an angelic halo.
An actual halo.
An actual halo. He starts having these intense prophetic-style visions. Meanwhile, Saladin Chamcha, who's this character that has tried so hard to shed his Indian heritage, he sprouts horns, a tail, goat legs. He literally becomes devilish.
So Rushdie is making the internal struggle of the migrant experience physical. He's taking the metaphor and making it real. Chamcha is the alienated individual, and Jibril is the connection to spirituality and home.
That's the thematic engine, absolutely. Rushdie himself called it a novel about migration, metamorphosis, divided selves. It's exploring that, that often agonizing struggle of having a divided identity, Indian yet British, modern yet religious.
And it mirrors his own life, in a way.
It does. It very much mirrors his own diasporic identity. The plot follows their lives in London after this transformation. Chamcha is arrested by the police, which is this sort of brutal symbol of the immigrant experience in Britain at the time.
Right.
And Jibril, he's pursuing his lost love, an English mountaineer, but he's also suffering from mental illness and these overwhelming religious visions.
So how does that all resolve for them, this duality?
Well, the ending gives a pretty clear thematic answer. Chamcha eventually goes back to Bombay, he reconciles with his dying father, and in that act of embracing his roots, he sheds his devilish traits.
So he becomes whole again by accepting his past.
Exactly. But Jibril, he fails to resolve his inner turmoil. He gets consumed by jealousy, by anguish, and in a classic tragic arc, he murders his lover and then takes his own life. So thematically, it's a brilliant exploration of identity and what it takes to integrate a divided self.
Okay, that sounds like a fascinating, purely literary text, but the parts that really detonated the controversy, they weren't this main storyline in London and Bombay.
Yo.
It was the stuff happening inside the main story, the dream visions Jibril has. This is where the literary freedom really collides with sacred religious history.
That is the critical fault line. The dreams are what fueled the backlash. These nested visions, they include a sort of revisionist biography of a prophet named Mahound in a city called Jahiliya.
And Mahound and Jahiliya are clearly references to the Prophet Muhammad in the city of Mecca.
Unmistakably and intentionally so. And it's in this dream sequence that we find the incident that gives the book its title, the Satanic Verses legend.
Can you explain that legend for us?
Of course. It's a disputed apocryphal story. In Rushdie's fictional version, the prophet Mahound briefly preaches that three pagan goddesses are legitimate divine intercessors. He says their worship is permitted. But he later revokes this, and he declares that the revelation wasn't from God, but it was a diabolical mistake, hence the Satanic Verses. And this episode, woven into this imaginary narrative, it was seen by many in the Muslim world as a grotesque and malicious attack on the prophet's character, and crucially, on the purity of the Quran itself.
I think we need to pause on the literary context here, because understanding how highly it was regarded makes the violence that followed even more shocking. Where did this novel sit in 1988?
It was published right at the peak of Rushdie's fame. His earlier novel, Midnight's Children, was a huge success. And this book, as a work of postmodernism, it draws on so many influences. You can see James Joyce in the wordplay, Kafka in the bureaucratic nightmare Chomchak goes through.
And you mentioned a key comparison earlier to Bulgakov's Master and Margarita. That novel also famously satirizes religion. It has a revisionist portrayal of Pontius Pilate and Jesus. Why was Rushdie's version received so differently?
That's such an essential question. Bulgakov's book was suppressed by the Soviet regime for political reasons, sure, but the Christian world didn't erupt in violent condemnation. The crucial difference is the relationship that Muslims hold with the Prophet Muhammad and the textual integrity of the Quran.
So it's about the specific nature of the sacredness being challenged.
Precisely. In postmodernism, the author is kind of given a license to play with history, to mix myth and reality, to treat all narratives as just text. And the literary community celebrated Rushdie for exactly that.
But for believers?
For those who hold the Prophet Muhammad as the perfect human exemplar and the Quran as the final untainted word of God, this wasn't seen as mere fiction or critique. It was seen as an existential attack on the very foundation of their faith.
So the very thing that made the novel a critical darling, its willingness to treat sacred history as just more material, was the precise source of the offense.
Exactly. The critics lauded its imagination. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It won the Whitbread Award. The critic Harold Bloom even called it Rushdie's largest aesthetic achievement. All this praise came before the storm. But it was that same ambition that set the stage for a catastrophic collision when it entered the real world.
Which brings us to Section 2. Here's where things get really intense. How does a high-concept novel about assimilation suddenly transform into a geopolitical crisis with riots, murder, and diplomatic fallout?
It happens because, for many devout Muslims, Rushdie's work crossed a fundamental red line. It was about the honor of the Prophet Day. The offense wasn't just that it was fiction, it was that he used real, revered people, the Prophet, his wives, his companions, and then wove what were seen as crude, offensive fabrications about them under these thinly veiled names.
Let's talk about those names. You mentioned the fictional prophet was called Mahound. That name itself has a history, doesn't it?
It has immense historical weight, and this is a piece of context that's often missed in the West. Mahound is not a neutral name. It's a derogatory term for Muhammad that came from medieval Christian polemics.
It was used to portray him how?
As a demon or a false god. So by deliberately choosing that specific word, even in a dream sequence, Rushdie was perceived as engaging in historic, hateful slander, not just literary critique.
I see.
So Muslim commentators, they argued that the novel was hurling filth and indecency. Specific things in the novel, like the prophet endorsing idols or very disrespectful portrayals of his wives, were seen as fictions designed purely to mock and to wound.
So for believers, this wasn't art. It was perceived as a deliberate act of spiritual violence.
That's a good way to put it.
What was the immediate global response at a government level?
It was immediate and visceral. In late 1988, before many people had even read it, the Indian government banned the novel. Pakistan followed suit in November. And within months, basically all Muslim-majority countries had banned it.
And the public response followed right behind, even in the West.
Yes. We saw huge angry protests in London, in Bradford, New York, often with public book burnings, which immediately brought up this terrifying historical context of censorship.
And then it escalated beyond symbolic acts.
It did. We started seeing firebomb attacks on bookstores that dared to carry the novel.
Yeah.
That's when you knew this was moving beyond debate into active physical conflict.
And tragically, the first fatalities occurred in early 1989.
Yes, in February 1989, things hit a tipping point in Islamabad, Pakistan. A large crowd protesting the book assaulted the U.S. Cultural Center, and the confrontation turned lethal. 6 people died.
Wow.
The speed with which a book led to multiple deaths was just It was chilling, and it set the stage for what came next.
Which was the ultimate political dimension. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's fatwa, this is what turned it from a domestic issue into an international emergency.
On February 14, 1989, Khomeini, who was the supreme leader of Iran, issued this devastating fatwa. Now, a fatwa is normally a non-binding religious opinion, but this one was different.
Because of his political authority.
Yes, and because it was so specific, it called for the death of Salman Rushdie and anyone involved in publishing the book who knew what was in it.
It was a state-sponsored death warrant.
That crossed international borders. It placed a bounty on Rushdie's head that was maintained and even increased over the years, reaching about $3 million by 2016. And it's important to remember, Iran's later government has repeatedly said the decree is still in force.
That's just staggering. But the threat wasn't just against Rushdie, was it? What were the tangible consequences for other people associated with the book?
The human toll is where this becomes terrifyingly real. The targets became the people whose job it was simply to translate and publish the work.
The people bridging the cultural gap.
Exactly. In 1991, the Japanese translator Hitoshi Igarashi was murdered in his office. That same year, the Italian translator Ettore Capriolo was stabbed and seriously wounded. Then in 1993, the Norwegian publisher William Nygaard was shot 3 times outside his home.
So this was not an abstract debate. This was targeted transnational violence.
Against intellectual labor, yes.
So on the other side of this cultural fault line, what was the primary counter-argument from Western governments and intellectuals?
The overwhelming defense was mounted on the principle of free expression. Western governments condemned the fatwa as a barbaric violation of human rights. Writers, politicians, they all rallied behind Rushdie.
People like Christopher Hitchens.
Right. Hitchens called the fatwa the opening shot in a cultural war on freedom. He saw it as an attempt to impose religious censorship on liberal democracies.
And this controversy had a real structural impact on laws in the West too, didn't it?
Absolutely. It became a huge flashpoint in Britain. It highlighted the fact that the UK still had these antiquated blasphemy laws rooted in Christianity. The pressure from this controversy helped push the government to eventually scrap those laws entirely.
So the whole thing became this defining moment, creating what our sources call a deep fault line of culture.
That's right. You have this profound core tension. Western free speech values, including the right to satirize the sacred, pitted against the insistence from large parts of the Muslim world that the Prophet's honor is inviolable. It's a conflict about defining the limits of respect in a globalized world.
Okay, so we've established the 2 dominant reactions, literary celebration and lethal condemnation. But our sources describe this third, really constructive response, one that aims to defend the faith not with force, but in, and I'm quoting here, the most pragmatic, most powerful, peaceful, and Islamic way.
A way that focuses on principled conduct.
Exactly. Let's explore the teachings of Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad, which offer a theological blueprint for this compassionate and intellectual defense.
This third response is, I think, the most vital part of this deep dive, because it addresses the provocation head-on, but it does so while fundamentally upholding the highest status of Almighty Allah and embodying the true character of the Prophet. It completely excludes human violence.
And it starts with an absolute rejection of punishment for blasphemy.
An absolute and uncompromising rejection. Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad explicitly stated, "The Islam I learned from the Holy Prophet speaks of no punishment whatsoever against blasphemy, no question of death or anything else for that matter."
That is a complete theological refutation of the fatwa. It pulls the rug out from under the justification that Khomeini claimed to have.
It absolutely does. And the source for this isn't some modern political idea. It's grounded entirely in the actual historical example of the Prophet Muhammad himself. To understand this, we have to look at a specific incident with a man named Abdullah bin Ubay.
And who was he? Why is his case so important?
Abdullah bin Ubay wasn't just some random critic. He was the leader of the hypocrites in Medina. He was an internal political saboteur who was constantly trying to undermine the Muslim community, spreading rumors, insulting the Prophet personally, all while pretending to be a Muslim.
A persistent internal threat.
A huge one. At one point, some of the leading companions, they were just furious with his behavior, and they pleaded with the Prophet to have him executed. They argued he'd committed treason and his actions were worthy of death.
So if there was ever a justification for retribution, this was it. An enemy committing treason and blasphemy right there. How did the Prophet respond?
He responded with an act of what you could call radical mercy. He completely refused any retribution. Our sources highlight that he smiled and said, "No, there is nothing to be done. There will be none to punish him."
Why? What was his reasoning?
He understood that executing a man who claimed to be a Muslim, even a known hypocrite, would have been politically disastrous. It would have led people to say, Muhammad kills his own companions.
But the compassion went even further than that, didn't it?
It did. The source material emphasizes that when Abdullah bin Ubay later died, the Prophet Geen went to his funeral. He led the man's funeral prayer and kept praying for his forgiveness. This incident becomes the ultimate precedent. It shows that Islam's highest standard of conduct, especially when you're personally attacked, is mercy and forgiveness, not revenge. That moral high ground is seen as the true, most powerful defense of the Prophet's honor.
But some might argue that relying on mercy is noble but insufficient. When your opponent is using violence and state power, like Khomeini was, doesn't that risk looking weak?
That's the challenge, right? And the answer in this theological framework lies in the difference between justice and vengeance and a supreme trust in God's role. The argument is that human vengeance is weakness. It compromises the moral high ground, and it usurps Allah's role as the ultimate judge.
And this is all rooted in Scripture.
Entirely. It's rooted in the Quranic mandate for forbearance. There are explicit calls for patience, like, and let them pardon and overlook. Would you not love that Allah should forgive you? This tells the believer to rise above personal offense.
And what about, there is no compulsion in religion? That seems absolutely central here.
It is. That fundamental declaration in the Quran underscores that faith has to be genuine. It can't be coerced by the threat of death. Coercion makes belief hollow. So killing someone for their beliefs, no matter how offensive, is seen as a grave violation of a core Quranic principle.
Okay, so if the defense can't be lethal force, then what is the proper disciplined, peaceful defense? When the Prophet's character is misrepresented like this, what is the action that mobilizes people in an inspiring, engaging manner?
The required action is intellectual mobilization. It's scholarly refutation. The Quran says that Allah himself guards the revelation. Indeed, it is we who send down the message, and indeed, we will be its guardian.
So the very premise of Rushdie's plot point, that Satan could corrupt the message, is refuted by Scripture itself.
Exactly. So the job of the believer isn't to take revenge or to try and defend God's power. It's to defend the truth through evidence, through wisdom, and by setting a better moral example. That is how you uphold the highest status of Almighty Allah, by trusting Him and using the tools of reason.
Which means the crisis becomes an educational moment.
Precisely. The core teaching is to invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good instruction. The response must be the most pragmatic, most powerful, peaceful, and Islamic one, which means truthful dialogue and evidence should address the errors, not anger addressing the slight. The goal is to educate people about Islam. That's far more inspiring than rage.
And we have a concrete example of this scholarly defense that stands in direct contrast to the fatwa.
We do. Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad explicitly denounced Khomeini's fatwa as being incompatible with the Prophet's example, and instead of calling for violence, he commissioned a detailed, reasoned rebuttal, a book titled Rushdie, haunted by his unholy ghosts.
And what was the method of that book? How did it counter Rushdie's narrative?
It was a systematic refutation. It went through Rushdie's errors line by line, using established Quranic commentary and verified historical sources to correct the record. It didn't rely on emotion, it relied on textual criticism and historical fact. This is how you mobilize a community for intellectual engagement, not for violence.
So the goal wasn't suppression of the offensive material, but the creation of new, constructive material that could educate and strengthen the community's faith.
Exactly. The aim was to educate the masses about Islam and its founder, and empower believers with knowledge, not spread hatred. The entire stance is captured in that powerful motto, love for all, hatred for none. This intellectually grounded approach is the key.
This shift in focus from retribution to education really seems like the most impactful takeaway for anyone listening who's trying to understand this.
Absolutely. Let's just quickly synthesize the key principles of this response.
Please.
First, prioritize forgiveness and patience, following the Prophet's example of mercy. Second, defend the truth with knowledge, not hatred. This is the only way to mobilize people in that inspiring, engaging manner we talked about. Third, uphold justice, but trust in Allah's sole right to judge. And fourth, protect freedom of conscience for everyone. By choosing this path of compassion and intellectual rigor, the community not only defends its faith effectively, but it lives up to the ideal of the Prophet being a mercy to all the worlds.
It successfully upholds the highest status of the faith by showing it's stronger than human rage.
And that really connects this whole arc to the bigger picture. The deep dive reveals that the controversy wasn't a simple binary of fiction versus faith. It presented a choice.
A choice between what?
A choice between a political response rooted in reactive anger and lethal violence, and a theological response rooted in reasoned scholarship, historical forbearance, and the exemplary character of the Prophet Muhammad.
So we saw a work of fiction about alienation, a political reaction that resulted in a global crisis, and then a profound theological response that insisted on mercy and justice, upholding the dignity of faith through noble conduct and excluding human violence. It's a powerful lesson.
Which brings us to a final question for you, the listener, to think about. In a world that's just saturated with information and viral offense, where rage is often the most immediate and rewarded response, how does the act of patient, scholarly correction, choosing wisdom and mercy over retribution, how does that fundamentally change the nature of the conversation? And maybe more importantly, how does it change the character of the community that consistently chooses that patient, inspiring path? That's a choice that affects all of us, no matter what we believe.